Home sales show modest gains, but remain below last year's pace. What's causing the slowdown? We'll dive into it today.
The Federal Reserve held rates steady in June, but big changes could be coming. Join us today and find out what it means for mortgage rates.
More homes mean more opportunities. Find out how to adjust your strategy in today's market.
All that and more on this month's Market Update.
Welcome to this month's Market Update. I'm Gabi Brennesholtz, your co-host, and with me is our co-pilot, Ruben Gonzalez. How are you?
Good. How are you, Gabi?
Really, really well. It's been a fast month, and we have some refreshing new data to share today.
Yeah, let's just jump right into it. We'll start with the NAR stats. So first off, sales were up slightly from last month, about 1%. But when we look comparing it to last year, we're still down about 1%. So things are still at a fairly suppressed pace in terms of sales when we look back.
And it feels different this time around because when we were talking about suppressed home sales, we're also talking about a lot of buyers that are not getting into the market. So we have inventory rising, and yet we don't have a lot of action going on in terms of what's going on with the home sales.
Yeah, so that is the thing that's making this year different from last year, right? We're seeing rising inventory levels. We saw at the end of the month, inventory was up 20%. Compared to the previous year. We're at 4.6 months of supply, but as we said before, sales year over year down a bit, right? So, we're not in the situation where more inventories is translating directly to more sales, and the part of that story that is driving that is the lack of demand, right? That's the buyer side. So obviously we're seeing a mismatch a bit in a lot of markets between the number of buyers and the number of sellers. The exception right now, we talked about this in previous episodes a little bit, is the Northeast. So, compared to the rest of the country right now, the Northeast is still seeing relatively low inventory conditions. Their sales are still relatively suppressed, but they're doing a little bit better than the rest of the market. They were about flat year over year.
Really, the numbers that stand out are the South and the West, if we're taking a look at the different parts of the country, right? What differences are we seeing there?
Yeah, so that's where we're seeing kind of the most defined slowdowns, right? So when you look at NAR's figures, they show sales in the West down 9% from last year, and in the South down almost 4%. And that's translating into prices as well. So, in the West, prices are relatively flat right now. They showed about a 0.5% increase year over year, while in the South, they were actually down almost 1%. When you look at the NAR figures, you can see that the South and the West account for more than half of U.S. home sales, right? Mm-hmm. The smallest region in terms of sales figures is actually the Northeast, so the one exception. And then the Midwest right now is kind of straddling between the two of them. Sales were down slightly there. They were down about 2%. And when you look at their prices, they're at a year-over-year gain of about 3.4% right now, whereas the Northeast was still posting a 7% increase year over year.
So if I'm a buyer in the South, now is an opportune time to have a lot of options, right? And yet we're not really seeing that the buyers are jumping into the market. And I wonder if it's because they were hoping that interest rates would change. Yet we had some news from the Feds over the last week as well, Ruben.
In June, we had a Fed meeting. It also included a release of projections. We get those not quite every other meeting, but that basically means that they released their forecast for what they think the economy is going to be doing for the rest of the year. The result of that meeting was that they left the federal funds rate unchanged on the basis of us continuing to have a strong labor market in their view, as well as inflation still more or less being in line with their projections to get back to their target level. The real news that kind of came out of the meeting had more to do with the projections. It was pretty well expected the Fed wasn't going to move rates this month because we've seen, in the last meeting, they mentioned it as well, the continued uncertainty from tariffs, waiting for that to get into the economy. It's not going to happen overnight. They're still anticipating increased inflation. So when we looked at their projections, the things to note, their projection for GDP slowed down some. So in March, when they released projections, it was at 1.7% for this year. This last month, it was only at 1.4%. For inflation, it went from 2.7% to 3%. So they're expecting slightly more inflation than they were previously expecting now. And their projections for unemployment were relatively unchanged. So that went from about 4.4 to 4.5. But notably for next year, it went from 4.3 to 4.5. So still in a very healthy place for the economy, just kind of showing some anticipation that the economy as a whole is going to slow down and the labor market will slow down a bit with it. So what does that mean, right? What do we actually care about?
And why do we care about it in the real estate realm, right?
Exactly. So mortgage rates, right?
Yeah.
Right now, they're projecting about 2 decreases still from the Federal Reserve for this year. So right now, the timing estimates are for essentially sometime late Q3. We're expecting a quarter of a point decrease, 25 basis points, and another one sometime in Q4. So for a total of a half a point this year. Now we know from looking back through history, those frequently don't translate to a one-to-one movement for mortgage rates. So we can probably expect at a maximum a decrease of a half a point as a result of the federal funds rate, a one-to-one, but more likely it's going to be somewhere lower than that. So between no change and 0.5 somewhere, maybe 0.3, 0.2 is kind of realistically what we might expect that to shave off of rates. So solely from Federal Reserve policy, we can't expect to see any kind of dramatic downward movement in rates this year. And I think like you've mentioned, there's still a lot of buyers that seem potentially to be waiting for that rate drop to come. Even if it's not coming this year, when you look at further projections from the Fed, they're only projecting about a 1-point drop total really from the end of this year through really like 2027 right now. So that's not a lot of room for rates to come down as a result of Federal Reserve policy, even on a 2 to 3 year time horizon. So in all likelihood, rates between somewhere in the mid 5s to 6.5% range seem likely to persist over the next couple of years.
And I think that's a really valid point to make for those of our listeners today that were eager to, or that were hoping that we may find rate drops much more than that, yet the reality looks like it's going to remain just about the same or very similar to the interest rates that we're seeing now. That, in addition to the rising inventory, may mean for motivated buyers that if they're seeing something that they like now, motivated meaning they have to move, right, because of job changes or because of life circumstances changing, that now might be a really good time to get with a real estate professional to identify how to take advantage of more inventory, because we continue to have more options than ever for those who wish to buy or to invest.
Yeah, and I also think it's important to note that even though as a result of Fed policy, there's not a lot of projection for rates to come down, there are other factors that can influence things, right? We've seen treasuries move recently because of, instability on sort of like global politics. We saw rates move because of tariffs. So there's a lot of things that can influence kind of the 10-year treasury rate that then translate into the mortgage rate. So we're going to see continued volatility there. And it's not necessarily impossible to say that rates could come down a bit more. But I think realistically, that's the range we should be looking at when we talk about where mortgage rates could be a year from now, or even 2 years from now. Though the further out you go, the more uncertainty there is. And if you look in the Fed projections, one thing you also will notice, they have a couple places there where they actually kind of put some numbers behind their uncertainty, and you can see that, it's very elevated right now. So in the last 2 meetings, they've basically put that their uncertainty has been increasing. And it didn't decrease much from last meeting to this meeting, despite some of the news we've had around tariffs and changes and things, because nothing's really been settled out yet, right? A key point is to understand there's just a lot of uncertainty around any projections right now. And I also think that clients are feeling that uncertainty, right? It's hard to make big decisions when it's difficult to understand where things are going to be a year from now, both for the economy, for mortgage rates, for your job. There's a lot of uncertainty right now. So I think we can do a lot to educate ourselves, communicate that, and being able to speak to that, I think, goes a long way in this kind of environment.
Yeah, that's right. Well, and if interest rates have been a key objection point for a home buyer in hopes that interest rates might go down any further than what projections are looking like, then the reminder may be, or a specific strategy for a real estate professional is to remind the buyer that you're just dating the rate. You don't have to marry it, and that there are several different ways that you can adjust your payments over time. And that if you're purchasing real estate, consider the long range view.
So, looking back at the numbers again, we're looking at home prices were only up 1.3%. Inventory's going up 20%. That's kind of consistent, especially if you were to just zoom in on the markets other than the Northeast, what we'd probably considered more of a buyer's market, right? We're seeing this sort of fundamental shift in a way of leverage right now, right away from home sellers as more inventory builds up on the market and toward home buyers. And in a environment too, where home buyers are a little bit few and far between at that. So even more leverage potentially building there. What are some strategies we can talk about for agents to deal with this kind of like new kind of paradigm that they're going to be operating in as the market shifts?
Yeah. On the buyer side, I think it's as easy to explain, for every 10 homes that you see in the market, 2 additional homes have potentially come up in your price band that now match your criteria because of that 20% increase we're seeing year over year. I think that's really encouraging for buyers that are intending on getting into the market now. I would say for small investors, that's similar to what we're seeing as well compared to your average family that is intending to purchase property. The seller sides are different because on the seller side, if you have to make a move right now, then you want to make sure that you are winning the beauty pageant and that you are following the advice of your real estate professional to make sure that out of those 10 homes that may be on the market, you are number 1 or number 2 that will shine, right? Being on the top of what it looks like to be fully marketed on the search engines, to have professional pictures done, and to have an effective system, a launch system for your listing that may be coming on the market is key, because in those first 30 days is when you are going to attract likely the buyer that the following 30 or 60 days may want to make an offer because of how the property showed digitally.
Yeah, I think you hit on an important point there that I've heard from agents as well in a market like this, is that it's important to try to be the most attractive home in your price range, right? So I think that's a change, right, from an environment where there was a lot of demand, right? And it was easy to just put a listing sign in a yard and a house would sell. Now there's going to be a lot more preparation that potentially that goes into it.
Yeah. And that is really the tale of this market, especially with the inventory being up, right? Because in the past, it was easy to price a property and frankly, to continue to drive the high demand and low inventory to drive those prices up. Now the story is different because now you want to, instead as a seller, think about how to prepare most effectively leading up to the launch of your listing so that over the next few months, you may attract someone who continues to remember your house compared to the others that are coming up on the market. So having a real estate professional who continues to show what is on the market and what the properties ended up selling for and at what price, so that you as a seller are also most informed of what original list prices were and where they ended up selling. The other thing is that depending on where you are in the country, you may want to ask your real estate professional on how to price ahead of the market and what that means. Because some of the list prices that were pulled 30 or 60 days ago when your consultation with a real estate professional to get your home ready for market may have been had, may have already seen different price adjustments that are needed based on where your market is headed. So get really clear on your local statistics with your real estate professional to understand, is the price that we are planning on listing our property for in the next 30 days still the price that we should be listing for? Or do we need to make some adjustments based on how closed sales or under contract sales are coming in? It is common for real estate professionals to connect with their peers to get a little bit more intel in regards to what they are seeing based on the under contracts that are also coming up in the MLS.
Yeah, and I think, you hit on this right now, what a comp is. In this kind of market, it becomes more specific, right? The
Absolutely.
more recent, the more actually comparable a listing is, like, it becomes incredibly important to try to really kind of zone in and narrow down into that category of where that house is, which is difficult when there's not a lot of homes selling. So you may have to hunt a little bit, but the more specific you can get, like the better the pricing strategy is going to be.
Yes. At the end of the day, if you put up a property for sale for $1 and it's going to be worth $350,000, the best thing that can happen for a seller in today's market is to let multiple offers drive the price to what the market will bear. And unfortunately, what we're seeing too much of right now is that we continue to see sellers who are listing properties based on a vision or a dream of what they thought the property was worth a year ago or even 3 or 6 months ago. And the reality based on the data is that those prices no longer hold true, which is exactly to your point, Ruben, why we want to make sure that we're getting hyper localized and hyper clear on what the activity has been in the last 30 days and where the market is headed. And in those cases, it is headed towards a flat, if not slightly downward trend in terms of home prices.
Along with buyers having more opportunity, we're also seeing sellers need to have more difficult conversations, right? We've talked a little bit about pricing already, but the other thing we know is that a lot of buyers right now are also sellers. So on the back end, it's like they're being held up a little bit by their own home sale in terms of like becoming serious buyers on the market. So, What are some strategies maybe to help navigate that quagmire of like the contingency issue? I've got a house, I need to sell it. We're having pricing conversations, but on the other side, I maybe have more leverage by like it gets a little bit more complicated there, right?
Yeah. And to add to the matter, a lot of those sellers also happen to have a lot of equity, right? So the bottlenecks prevail. And I think clear communication with the strategy with professionals and the other parties involved in the transactions is going to be key. The gift for those who may have double transactions, right? I have to sell a property and then I have to go purchase one, is that there is more inventory out there and that there is actually more flexibility for someone to have the communication to say, hey, I'm going to have to sell my house and here's what we are doing specifically to price the property. That can be done with, a letter to the other party that, may have their home for sale that the seller wants to purchase, and to explain to them what contingency actually means and looks like.
Yeah, it's interesting because if I have a house right now and I need to sell it, right,
in
order to buy another one, I have more opportunities out there as a buyer. Like I've seen nicer properties come up for potentially better prices. I can negotiate a little bit more. But I also have this sort of perceived theoretical amount of equity I have in my own home that I want to try to maximize. But in reality, a lot of that equity to some extent is fictitious, right? Like I've never realized it. Perhaps it was there a year ago. It's not there now. But I think getting over that mental hurdle of how much, I guess, am I willing to give up in terms of this perceived equity that I had in order to move up into this nicer situation using my actual existing equity when I do sell my house it's a hard conversation. It's a little bit of a mental hurdle to get over as a seller. And we've seen it in other types of assets, right? Like people don't like to sell depreciating assets, especially after they've been, on a run up, right? It's like once you get over that sort of roller coaster hump, whether it's stocks or anything else, people have a little harder time selling into a depreciating market just on the hope that like it's going to come back, right?
Absolutely. And an idea in terms of the communication plan may be that when you connect with your real estate professional that is helping you list the property, that you may discuss the best case scenario and the likely scenario. And based on, how much you still owe on your mortgage plus the amount of equity that you have gained, you're going to have a range, or you're going to have two sets of numbers. Why not plan on the ideal case scenario, not the best case scenario, to know how much equity you might have to roll into your new property so that you as the seller have clarity on what that looks like and feel comfortable about making an offer on the next property based on a range that you are likely going to walk away with. Everything else may be cherry on top. Maybe that is what ends up furnishing the property.
I think that's exactly right.
So Ruben, as we're looking at the new information, what are some of your final thoughts for the month of June?
I think it's a couple things. I think the news from the Fed was interesting but expected. Mortgage rates are elevated and probably going to stay here for a little while. We've seen them come down a bit. We're around 6.8% right now, down from where they had been here, well over 7%. But for the most part, we should expect them to stay probably in the mid sixes for the remainder of the year. I think in terms of markets, right, we saw that, we're seeing rising inventory in most parts of the country, with the exception of the Northeast, of course. And that, that's a bit of an adjustment. We've come from a low sales, low inventory environment. Now we're moving in kind of a low sales, higher inventory environment, which is a little bit different. And everyone's adjusting to that. I think those are kind of the themes right now. And we're kind of heading into that peak real estate season where all that stuff's really going to become more and more obvious to everyone as they're getting involved in the marketplace.
And the obviousness can breed those opportunities for those who have been waiting all year and are ready to take advantage of it. A 20% increase of inventory year over year should be a sign for those who want to get in the market to seriously consider communicating, adjusting their list searches with their real estate professional or on their online search engine of choice, and to get ready because interest rates are going to pretty much remain what they are. And if should they have a slight change, the idea might be that you also want to talk to your favorite mortgage professional to understand what some of the ways may be that over time you can adjust your payment or adjust the rate game so that you are reminded you don't have to marry your rate. You simply get to date it. So if we're completely off, Ruben, there is an opportunity for someone to make those changes if rate is important.
Absolutely. Affordability is still a challenge, but more inventory means more opportunities for buyers and for those with, the equity or other finances that they can aim toward housing right now. There's opportunity.
Ruben, thanks so much again for your insight this month.
Yeah, thank you for joining us to put some strategy to our data.
Absolutely. And for those of you who enjoy strategy, data, and more information about economics, click like and hit subscribe on our YouTube channel and check us out on your favorite podcast platform. We look forward to having you with us again next month.
See you soon.